Welcome to Solutions Through Reproductive Health, Why Family Planning Matters to Climate Change. My name is Meredith and I'm with the Office of Sustainability. We're really excited to have you all here, and if you have questions at any point, the Q&A is open. So if you want to drop a question, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. First, we'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Marine Biology Club, Community Planning Group, and Permaculture Tigers, and of course, Hannah Evans with Population Connection. Hannah is interested in working with students, professors, and activists to promote positive social and environmental change. She works with college-level students and professors to integrate population studies back into the mainstream with a particular focus in human rights and social justice. She develops and gives comprehensive, solution-oriented presentations focused on the connections between global population health, access to comprehensive reproductive health care, and environmental sustainability. Through the examination of some of the root causes of population growth, her work seeks to highlight the interconnections between poverty, marginalization, women's health, and environmental pressures made worse by climate change. Before joining Population Connection staff, Hannah worked as an adjunct professor of women's studies and taught classes on gender, science, and feminist theory. She has nonprofit experience working as a program developer for sustainable agriculture and public health programs in Honduras and Panama, and has worked as a researcher on food security issues throughout Southern California. Hannah holds a BA in environmental policy and political science and has a master's in political ecology from San Diego State University, where her research focused on sustainable labeling and ethical consumption. Now I'm going to hand it over to Hannah, and she's going to go over a little bit what we're going to be talking about today.
All right, thanks, Meredith. Let me go ahead and share my screen to get my PowerPoint up. And I will just get started, right? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this opportunity and look very forward to this presentation as well as a discussion period afterwards. As Meredith mentioned, my name is Hannah Evans, and I work for an organization called Population Connection, which is a US-based nonprofit organization that advocates for increased US funding for family planning programs and reproductive health internationally. And in addition to a lot of the advocacy work we do, we are also very invested in education and outreach, specifically surrounding some of the major issues we work on. So the connections between population dynamics globally, access to comprehensive healthcare, and environmental sustainability. So today we're going to be covering a lot of different information. Obviously, those subjects are very broad, and we're going to be looking at kind of their intersections from various standpoints, paying particular attention to the capacity for health and education and reproductive health in particular to help mitigate and ultimately offset climate emissions, as well as increase climate resilience for populations all across the world. So we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm just assuming that many of you have not heard of Population Connection as an organization. So I'm just going to take a minute or two here at the beginning to discuss in a little bit more depth what we work on conceptually. So as an organization, Population Connection focuses again on the links between global population dynamics and population growth in particular, access to comprehensive reproductive health care, and environmental sustainability. So as an environmental organization, we are very interested in understanding and educating the public about the different ways that humans impact and are impacted by the environment, including the ways in which we contribute to climate change from various standpoints. And as a human rights-based organization, we're very interested and focused on understanding the root causes of things like high fertility rates within countries and regions, as well as rapid population growth. But specifically within the context of reproductive autonomy. So paying very close attention to unmet needs for family planning and reproductive healthcare services worldwide, and also recognizing that when women, statistically speaking, all across the world, are able to make their own decisions about their own reproduction, fertility rates naturally drop in that context. More women go to school, find and obtain sustained employment. Women, children, and families are healthier overall, And it's a very sort of necessary precursor to development, especially for lower income regions. We also sort of conceptually utilize what's called a PHE, or a population health and environment approach to developmental solutions. So this means that we strive to educate about the very interconnected nature of both environmental sustainability and public health. So whenever we're looking at kind of these massive global issues, and you're going to see that everything's kind of approached from a big, like, scale, it's important to recognize that underlying many of these massive issues are sort of these indirect correlations between things. So for example, whenever we're looking at the sort of underlying causes of human-induced environmental problems like habitat destruction or deforestation, they can ultimately many times be traced back to issues of poverty, of marginalization, of lack of access to economic alternatives, to public health, and so on. And so using a PHE approach, theoretically, if you're wanting to abate this, you can do so by increasing access to public health, to family planning, to education, to economic opportunity, to environmental education, and so on, as a way of promoting community-based environmental sustainability and conservation, while also increasing the standards of living and the overall well-being of populations at large. And more, this sort of theory is based off of the realization that I think COVID-19 has made us confront in very sort of harsh and rude ways, which is that humanity, the health of humanity, is very much dependent on the health of the planet and vice versa. And so a lot of our focus recently as an organization, and the work that I in particular focus on, looks at the links between population dynamics and climate change, and in particular, the ways that humans impact and are impacted by a progressively warmer planet. The climate crisis is undoubtedly the most pressing issue of our time. It's a global challenge that we're facing collectively. And it really needs to be addressed in comprehensive ways that are both complex and nuanced, using every modality we have available. As you can see here by looking at this slide, a significant portion of our planet is seeing warmer than average temperatures, and there are many different places that are actually breaking records for heat. 2020 was no different than 2019, and we're on pace to be pretty much in the same situation going forward. And ultimately, what we need to sort of contend with is that we're at a sort of precipice. We can really, engage in substantial mitigation efforts from all angles, recognizing, of course, that there are many different contributors to climate change and global sustainable development and so on. Or we, can choose to go down the path that we've been going on for a really long time. And, the latter will definitely result in an uninhabitable planet for future generations. So this is a very crucial point in time. We need to be looking at and sort of addressing climate change as the imminent global threat that it is. And to help, I think, support the urgency with which we need to be approaching these sort of climate solutions, although I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, I think it's really helpful to understand some of the synergies between the coronavirus pandemic, which of course has affected the entire planet, and climate change, because I think that there are some really interesting and important synergies that can help sort of elucidate the sort of opaque-ness of climate change in certain ways. COVID, of course, has essentially flipped our entire world upside down and really called into question the very resilience of our fragile world economy, at least as it's developed since the Industrial Revolution. And while COVID is, of course, playing out much more quickly than climate change, the effects of climate change are going to be just as far-reaching, if not way more far-reaching. In fact, many predict climate impacts to be much worse over the long term, and that's probably going to be true even in the short term. So in terms of synergies, both COVID-19 and climate change are, of course, global in scope and will affect everyone, with the world's most marginalized populations being the most vulnerable and feeling the most severe effects. Both are going to require large-scale government intervention and response, including help with economic transitioning. And both have tipping points, importantly. meaning that if we wait too long before we take action, a cascade of effects will result, and the effectiveness at that point of our interventions will not be nearly as impactful or effective. And this graph, I think, has become quite popular in helping us to understand the scope and severity of COVID-19. And it shows what we would have needed to do, of course, in order to flatten the curve or to prevent a surge in new cases that would overwhelm our healthcare systems. Again, this, of course, didn't happen, as everybody's well aware of, in most places. But had we been able to stay below the curve by staying at home, we would have been able to prevent the widespread and largely uncontrollable increase in new cases. And our healthcare systems would have been able to sort of manage and to a certain extent control new outbreaks. Of course, again, this hasn't happened in the United States, but other countries are proving that this is a theory that is justified. And similarly, I think it would be helpful to look at the potential effects of climate change in kind of the same fashion. This graph is by no means perfect. It's meant to be used as a metaphor to sort of look at the synergies between COVID and climate change, but also the potential impacts of resisting any sort of mitigation efforts on the larger scale. And again, if we continue business as usual and emit unsustainable amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we're going to ultimately reach a tipping point, and at that point be unable to stop the compounding climate effects. But if we are able to stay below the climate curve, which in this case refers to, let's just say, the Paris Agreement, in which many different countries around the world have agreed to do whatever is necessary in order to keep temperature increases of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. We will be able to manage and again, to a certain extent, control and contain climate impacts. Again, this means that we need to be doing everything possible, using every modality we have available in order to stop this climate crisis, before it's too late. And so ultimately, I think that there are many different global challenges that are interconnected that are facing the planet and humanity today. Most of which are of our own creation as humans. Again, in many ways, the very structure of our capitalist, sort of deregulated world economy, at least as it's developed since the Industrial Revolution, is very much endangering us, right? As it is sort of inherently viewing growth in specific ways. It has conventionally encouraged economies of scale, types of production, and consumption of fossil fuels, which of course contribute to climate change, of commodities that fuel deforestation and further contribute to climate change, of meat, all processes that are threatening the health and well-being of humans everywhere. And what's important to remember as we're kind of, conceptualizing all of these immense and massive global issues is that we as humans have created these systems and these processes and these incentives which are driving our world economy, which means that we have also the power to change it and to fix it and to ultimately create a more equitable and sustainable future for people on the planet. And it's important to remember before getting into kind of the more nuances of this presentation, while we're on the subject of coronavirus, I think it's important to remember that this virus itself manifested as a direct consequence of human activities and environmental degradation. And of course, while I'm sure I can speak for many people, when I say that the mounting severity of this pandemic has been a little shocking, scientists have actually been predicting this for a very long time and further contend that this is not the only pandemic that we're going to experience in our lifetimes unless we change the ways that we're interacting with the environment. COVID-19, as many of you likely know, is what is considered a zoonotic disease, which means that it was transferred to humans via an animal host, in this case, likely a bat. Other examples of zoonotic diseases that you are likely familiar with include Ebola, SARS, MERS, AIDS, among many, many others. But again, what I want us to start thinking about as we get into today's discussion is the fact that in investigating the underlying conditions that allow for these viral transfers and pathogen transfers to occur, Scientists are, continuously arguing that animals, despite being disease-carrying hosts, have much less to do with the likelihood of disease outbreaks in humans than humans do ourselves. And in a broader sense, many of the links between population and the environment are quite well known, especially I'm sure in this crowd. So worldwide, we affect the planet in many different ways. We destroy wildlife habitats, causing species to go extinct. We're changing the chemistry of the oceans. We're using resources at unsustainable rates. And as we're all well aware, we're contributing to climate change. And historically, many environmentalists have been really concerned about the continued growth of the human population for a variety of reasons, but largely because we know that increases in population growth correlates very linearly to increases in resource use and consumption patterns and environmental degradation in many cases. And in a macro context, this is actually proven to be very true. So if we look historically, we can see that fossil fuel production has increased in almost lockstep with population growth. And as we're going to get into a little bit later, population pressures contribute to a variety of social issues as well, including increases in infant and maternal mortality rates, less access to education, less access to employment and scarce resources, and so on. And the Global Footprint Network is an organization that is continuously coming out with new research looking at human demand for natural resources versus the Earth's capacity to regenerate in a certain amount of time. And their research is indicating that humanity is now demanding 60% more of our planet than its ecosystems can renew. However, in order to maintain 85% of the world's biodiversity, which is very important for creating a sustainable planet over time, human demand should only use half of what the planet can provide. So according to their research, this means that current demand exceeds that goal by at least a factor of 3. And again, I don't want to ever posit that population and environment studies are the sort of sole contributor to climate change. Of course, that's not true at all. But ultimately, what we have to really contend with is that one of the most important factors behind this growing imbalance between the Earth and human demands is the continued growth of the human population. And yet, I think in mainstream US culture, talking about population and the environment in the same sentence is really contentious, or at least in some circles. And as someone who works for an organization that focuses very heavily on this, I do know this to be true. But I think it's really unfortunate given how extremely vital addressing population dynamics are in sort of abating climate change and facilitating sustainable development and really creating a more habitable future for us over time. But why is there this sort of aversion to population and environment studies? Why does it exist? I think that there are a few major reasons why this sort of issue this issue remains, and I kind of want to tease through them a little bit with you all before we get into the rest of the presentation. And if anyone else has any contributions to this, we can talk about that in the discussion. I'd be happy to, because I think it's really interesting as well. So the first kind of, I think, assumption that people who are critical of population and environment studies make is that it's sort of common to pit population against consumption. And this narrative is commonly used, again, as a way of talking about or arguing that talking about global population growth as it relates to the environment is inherently unethical or immoral. And that's because, of course, if we were to linearly compare population growth and consumption patterns, we would very quickly see that consumption patterns and resource use varies very widely throughout the world. And the fact is that a very small fraction of the world's population consumes an overwhelming majority of the Earth's resources and produces a similarly disproportionate amount of CO2. So looking at population and as a singular or exclusive contributor to these massive and complex global problems like climate change is simply untrue. And ultimately, it really misses the point. Instead, we need to be looking at some of the major advantages associated with investing in smaller families and slowing population growth through voluntary measures, both now and for future generations. And emanating from that discussion are concerns that population growth will be used as a basis to blame certain populations for a global environmental crisis for which they are the least culpable. And in fact, oversimplified conclusions about the implications of population growth for things like mass famine and environmental change have actually been used and are presently being used as a basis to implement population control measures, so structural impositions of people's reproductive autonomy, which undoubtedly and every single time carries racist, classist, xenophobic, and misogynistic undertones. Rather, what we really need to be looking at are the underlying causes of high fertility rates, as well as rapid population growth, and the connections between population growth and things like poverty, exclusion, marginalization, and so forth. And from there, we need to look at, and figure out solutions that promote sustainable development across the world. So third, population studies really do seem to be entangled with some very harmful trigger words, such as that of population control, which rightfully carries a really heavy amount of historical and present day baggage. To be clear, slowing population growth as a means to create a more sustainable future has nothing to do ever with population control. In my opinion, the term shouldn't ever be used by organizations or people who are invested in this sort of practice. And again, any individual or organization who is engaged in population issues from a human rights perspective is likely never going to promote such a coercive and an inherently flawed approach. Instead, we need to look at population projections and demographic trends in terms of empowerment and respect. Respect for people, the environment, for future life, and so on. So striving for and maintaining a stable, sustainable population can sometimes also get caught up in religious debates, which can be very polarizing or divisive, often because they kind of boil down ultimately to very contentious issues and very polarizing issues like that of abortion. And in these cases, it's really important to stick to the well-established facts regarding the drivers of sustainable development, as well as the implications of rapid population growth alongside institutionalized poverty, access to resources, and so on. Actually, religion does not have to be a barrier. So take Iran, for example, and there are other countries as well, which we could have featured here, but Iran is kind of the classic example of this. This is a country that successfully brought its fertility rate down from about 7 children per woman in the 1950s to 1.77 into the mid 2000s. They did this in a number of years through massive PR campaigns, normalizing the process of accessing family planning services, making contraceptives and family planning services widely available and free, and actually soliciting the help of religious leaders in the efforts of, again, normalizing and sort of forming more cultural acceptance around the use and uptake of contraceptives and family planning services. Iran is one example, but there are many others as well. And of course, Iran is a very fundamentalist and religious country that's whose sort of religious principles pervade the country's culture in many different ways. And finally, and I think this point might be one of the most important for this particular presentation, is that issues related to population and the environment should never convert to absolute statements, which are, of course, untrue and very harmful. So for example, it's not helpful to say things like reducing population growth is the most significant issue of our time, or the single most effective solution to climate change would be to slow the growth of the human population. The world, of course, is a really complicated place, and climate change is a really complex issue. So, the assertion that there is one cause and one solution to something so massive and so interdisciplinary is myopic, right? In fact, investing in smaller families and reducing fertility rates has immediate social impacts, but doesn't have environmental impacts until the long term. And yet, if we do look at things in the long term, sort of hypothetically speaking, slowing population growth does have the potential to outperform anything else. So yeah, so those are some of the major issues related to, I think, population environment studies as I've conceptualized them, at least, and sort of in opposition, just in closing, to the use of false or absolute statements. We need to be looking at and really focusing on integrated solutions, solutions that simultaneously address many different issues at once, right? So that's kind of why we're integrating the population health and environment approach to climate solutions, is because things are complex and intertwined. And I think that one of the most compelling ways forward, not only for climate mitigation, but also for sustainable development, is to recognize this and to integrate it into our social, political, and economic systems. And so in terms of the global population, you can see here by looking at the purple line in particular, that the growth of the human population has increased substantially in relatively recent years, but that the growth rate is also falling quite significantly. But it's important to remember that although growth rates are slowing and will continue to slow, historically, the growth of the human population has essentially skyrocketed. In fact, up until 1800, it took all of human history to reach 1 billion people. And then thanks in large part to massive innovations put forth by the Industrial Revolution in terms of advancements in public health, access to technology, access to resources, and so on, we're now at a point where we're actually adding 1 billion people to the planet every 12 years. So this is actually unprecedented in terms of growth. Again, up until 1800, it took all of human history to reach 1 billion people. And now we're adding 1 billion people to the planet every 12 years. So as the population continues to grow into 2100, and it will, it's important to note that population growth is not actually happening evenly everywhere. In fact, many places are actually experiencing lower than average fertility rates or below replacement level fertility rates. And in some cases, countries are even experiencing population declines, which is a completely separate issue, of course. But as you can see, the places with the highest fertility rates represent largely some of the most marginalized places on Earth. So most of Africa, and in particular, sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the Sahel, the Middle East, parts of Latin America, parts of Asia. And again, this means that as a whole, the regions with the highest fertility rates and the fastest population growth rates are also what are known as LMICs, or low to middle income countries. And again, it's really vital to remember that this also means that population growth alone is not the #1 contributor to large scale environmental change or damage, as this logic would somehow indicate that the poorest populations are causing the most amount of environmental harm and contributing the most amount of CO2 emissions globally. And of course, this is not the case. This is a very dangerous oversimplification that has been used before and is just not, simply not an accurate statement. So this graph is based off of the UN's medium variant projections. So this is likely what's going to occur as of right now. And helps clarify where the majority of the world's population is expected to grow into the future. And while the places with the very highest fertility rates are also among the most economically challenged, there are many places where the population is growing very quickly alongside economic growth, which is kind of a point of interest for us in terms of the potential environmental implications. And to help clarify this, again, globally, we can look at the sort of demographic trends that are projected to occur in the next 50 to 100 years and what that will mean. So for example, whenever we're looking at like the sort of overall demographic makeup of the world, I think it's kind of common to assume that there's two worlds, right? There's a developing world and a developed world. And I think that things are a little bit more complex than that, right? And Hans Rosling, who actually created these little infographics and who has done a lot of research in statistics, but also demography, has actually reconceptualized the world's population in terms of levels based off of relative income as well as population size. And as you can see, the majority of the world, or around 5 billion people, are now currently residing in what are called low to middle income countries, or emerging economies. Yes. And historically, innovations in healthcare and advancements in technology and economic opportunity have really helped to increase livelihoods and standards of living for people and societies at large. This is what happened in the United States, as well as all of the other industrialized countries. And this is exactly what's projected to happen with the nearly 5 billion people who are currently residing in these sort of middle income countries. So, for example, think of all of the massive advancements that a country like China has made just in the past 30 to 50 years alone. Now at 1.4 billion people, this once developing nation is on par, and arguably already on par, with the most sort of socioeconomically advanced, so to speak, nations in the world. And they definitely will be by 2030, right? And by the way, this is a really great thing. I think that everyone deserves a better standard of living. Everyone deserves the ability to consume resources and to increase livelihoods and to live a comfortable life. And ultimately, there are a lot of advantages to this from a societal standpoint. So increased economic opportunity, for example, increases overall health rates, which then means lower fertility rates overall, which means slower population growth, which yields a variety of social, economic, and environmental benefits to society. So all great things. But again, as we're kind of considering these very imminent threats that we're facing by climate change, because of climate change, what will this increase in population and affluence mean for global environmental degradation that is, of course, set forth by consumption patterns, by resource use, by waste production, by habitat destruction, and so on? And additionally, what about the poorest 2 billion people on the planet, people living in level 1, for whom fertility rates are the highest and where population growth rates are the fastest? And this kind of brings up the issue of climate justice as well as climate vulnerability, because it is in these regions, the very poorest regions of the world, that are experiencing the highest population growth rates. And within the context of climate change, this means that more people are going to be at risk of experiencing the effects of climate change who lack the ability or capital to readily respond or recover, again, despite contributing the very least amounts in comparison to everybody else to the global problem. And so the fact is, there's a direct correlation between high fertility rates and poverty. Places considered marginalized, without access to vital resources such as clean water or healthcare or sanitation, economic opportunity, and so on, tend also to have the highest overall fertility rates, as well as the highest unmet need for contraceptives. And high fertility, especially in low-income regions, can impose a lot of costly burdens in these spheres. It may impede opportunities for economic development. It increases health risks for women and children, as well as families. And it ultimately, of course, erodes quality of life by reducing access to education, nutrition, employment, and scarce resources such as potable water. And so in terms of climate vulnerability, which is one of the very sort of prominent lenses from which we view the connections between population dynamics and climate change, it's important to note that the world's 47 least developed countries are also growing the fastest. So according to the UN, the total population of sub-Saharan Africa is expected to double by 2050, which would actually result in a 99% increase from the rates of today. Many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as well as South Sudan, are experiencing some of the world's fastest population growth rates while being among the most vulnerable to climate change. As you can see here, 9 out of the 10 most climate vulnerable countries are in sub-Saharan Africa, which again is projected to double in population just by 2050. And I think globally, the kind of geographical links between population and climate change are visible around the world. And it's worth noting, I think, that due to geography, many low-income regions are already prone to things like droughts, flooding, and natural disasters, all of which will increase significantly because of climate change. Climate change is already also inducing large-scale, largely in-country, but also out-country migration. Some estimates predict that over 143 million people will be forced to migrate as a direct result of crop failure, water scarcity, and sea level rise. And I've been reading recent reports as well that are magnifying that number up into the billions over time. And much of this coming migration, importantly from a demographic perspective, is going to shift populations of people over the next 30 years, especially from rural to urban areas. And much of this transition is also taking place, of course, in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, which are 3 places that represent over 55% of the world's developing regions. And again, in these contexts, high fertility can put lots of pressure on localized environmental and environments and sort of ecological outputs, including access to resources as well. And beyond that, no access to contraceptives or family planning or reproductive health really does make chronic poverty even worse. And to help kind of clarify the sort of climate justice issues entangled in population studies as well as climate vulnerability, I'll just go through a few examples here. So we can look at the sort of climate injustices associated with a country like Bangladesh, which is a really common example from which to sort of dissect this. But Bangladesh is actually about the size of New York, but it has a population of about 165 million people, making it the 8th most populous country in the world and encompassing about 2% of the global population. The country is growing very quickly. It's a very prominent emerging economy that's expected to exceed 200 million people by 2045, according to the UN's medium variant projection. So it could actually be much higher without access to family planning. From a climate vulnerability standpoint, Bangladesh is in a really precarious position. But Bangladesh contributes a fraction of CO2 emissions in comparison to the US. So per capita, the average Bangladeshi contributes about 4.4 metric tons of CO2 per year. The average American produces about 17. But it's projected to suffer really major damage from sea level rise in particular. It's actually projected that a 3-foot rise in sea level would submerge 20% of the country and displace more than 30 million people by the end of the century. And again, this is happening at a time where Bangladesh and Dakar are actually growing significantly. So a lot of people are immigrating and moving to these city centers. Its economy is sort of flourishing. There's a lot of opportunity there. So a lot of people are kind of coming in and out of these city centers within this country amidst compounding climate impacts that are creating a really dangerous situation. Some of you may remember the floods from this past summer that Bangladesh had to endure that were very devastating. As you can see, Bangladesh is located in a major floodplain, so it's already prone to sea level rise as well as flooding that's above average for geographically speaking. But during the summer, an estimated 37% of the country's landmass actually ended up becoming submerged. This displaced millions of people, over 4.7 million people, I think, to be exact. Over 55 people have died, most of them being children. And again, it's just creating these sort of compounding effects related to poverty and exclusion, marginalization, forced migration, and so on. This is just a NASA image that was taken over the course of a little over a month throughout the summer. And as you can see, just within this very short time period, a huge amount of the country was just completely inundated with water and flooded to the extent that, again, it caused massive displacement as well as the lives of many different people. So it's an ongoing issue that this country is going to have to sort of contend with alongside it being a really prominent emerging economy. Another example is that of the Sahel region of sub-Saharan Africa. And we've been talking a little bit, I think, about the reluctance to integrate population agendas into, or population dynamics into environmental agendas. And I think it's worth noting here that the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has actually come out and used this region and the sort of dynamics at play here as proof that population dynamics really do come into play very importantly as it relates to climate vulnerability, climate injustices, but also resilience and adaptive capacity. So the Sahel region of sub-Saharan Africa is a region that is, again, often referenced, both in, I reference it a lot and do research on it a lot, but also other organizations are focusing on it as well. And I think that's because it represents one of the most pressing environmental and humanitarian crises, in the world right now. So the Sahel region is experiencing temperature increases that are 1.5 times faster than that of the global average. And collectively as a region, it has the highest population growth rates in the entire world. So in the coming decades, the region's population is actually projected to grow from 100 million in 2010 to 240 million by 2050. Other studies have shown that people in the Sahel have already been using about 41% of the available carbon in the landscape by 2010, which is more than double the 19% used in 2000. So again, just looking at the sort of deficits, environmentally speaking, and the availability and the capacity for the populations there to produce food and to create this sort of sustainable economies and communities amidst these pressures. So as the population does continue to accelerate, food insecurity combined with limited arable lands, as well as decreasing crop yields due to temperature increases being so drastic, will ultimately mean, and already has meant, that there's going to be a lot of very hungry people. As you can see here, food security within this region is becoming an increasingly pervasive issue, and something that does not, necessarily seem like it's going to get any better anytime soon, especially because of the drastic impacts that the region is already seeing with regards to climate change, and the implications that has for the ability for people to grow food. And in this region especially, many people are subsistence farmers, right? So it's just creating a lot of very massive structural issues. So kind of in conclusion, with regards to climate vulnerability and population, it's important to note that in low-income regions that are growing quickly amidst a rapidly changing climate, slowing population growth through voluntary measures actually does have the capacity to greatly reduce suffering, deaths, and state instability. Population growth in these regions especially actually really hinders development, even economically, while simultaneously increasing hunger, resource use, localized environmental degradation, and habitat destruction. So as a solution, what we'd like to present is that investments in sustainable development, including education, healthcare, and women's empowerment, will help build resilience and adaptive capacity for populations all around the world, especially in the most high-risk regions. Within these solutions is a direct need as well for increased investments in comprehensive reproductive healthcare. Again, this is one very important solution to an adaptation strategy for climate change. And just quickly to review, access to sexual and reproductive healthcare can influence population dynamics through voluntary fertility reductions and through lower infant and maternal mortality rates, so increasing health overall. Additionally, comprehensive reproductive health care actually increases the health, welfare, and life expectancy of women and children. It advances individuals' rights and autonomy, reduces poverty, and ultimately, of course, slows population growth, which has a variety of social and environmental benefits. And together, cumulatively, these benefits help strengthen environmental sustainability as well as state stability. And coupled very essentially with family planning services is education. And it's common to see the two grouped together whenever looking at these solutions in a global scale. because they clearly complement each other, but also because they sort of co-constitute one another, right? In other words, increasing access to family planning services cannot be viewed in isolation because it is almost always not the be-all end-all solution. It's just as important that women, girls, boys, and men have access to education. Because among many other things, it very fundamentally facilitates independent and even critical thought, which is essential for breaking down cultural barriers or belief systems that may otherwise impede or prohibit or prevent the utilization of such an advantageous resource. But in particular, whenever education levels rise for women and girls, they gain social, economic, and political power. Ultimately, higher levels of education afford more options for sustainable employment and helps increase livelihoods overall. So given this information, it's really no surprise that women who are educated tend statistically to have fewer, healthier children. Expanding access to education is incredibly important for any society, but it's particularly vital as a component for sustainable development in low income, low resource settings. Again, these are regions that are already facing the biggest structural barriers to pretty much everything, including both getting an education as well as reproductive health care and family planning. And I'm sure in this crowd, especially, the benefits of reproductive health care are quite well known. And in part, I think that's because it's fundamentally recognized internationally as well as a human right. And very simply, it's a crucial aspect of overall health and well-being. But it's also interesting because it's something that's not always treated that way, right? It's not always considered or guaranteed as essential health care in the ways that other types of healthcare are. Because it really can't, I guess, seem to free itself from the entanglements of politics, of ideologies, cultural barriers, patriarchy, and just overt misunderstandings in many cases. So during the rest of the talk today, I want to try to just clarify the facts about reproductive health care and family planning, as well as their connections to sustainable development and climate mitigation and adaptation. I very much know and understand how touchy and sort of contentious this topic can be for many. But I think as we're sort of collectively working to abate the very, again, imminent and life-threatening challenges our planet and frankly our species are facing today, these existential threats, we need to be able to draw these connections in a nonpartisan, non-political way, right? And despite how complicated this issue is and has always been, I think there's real value in keeping things like pretty simple and stating the facts clearly. And luckily, there's a lot of really well-established, documented research out there that proves without question the importance of reproductive health in social and environmental terms, in addition to the dangers associated with restricting access. So in terms of bringing things together here and looking at the confluence of several major different issues in various regions throughout the world, it's important to note that worldwide, the same regions that experience high fertility, low economic status, and high climate vulnerability also usually have a high unmet need for contraceptives and reproductive healthcare services. This is largely a reflection of socioeconomic status, which can be traced back to histories of colonization, exclusion, or economic structure, and so forth. It's complicated, but there's a confluence of these huge issues, which is exacerbating, people's ability to survive and thrive. And within the context of reproductive health care, an unmet need for family planning services in regions that are already very vulnerable to climate impacts inhibits the ability of individuals, households, and communities to adapt to a changing climate. And in recognition of all of these very interconnected issues that magnify new and existing inequalities, there really should be greater attention paid to the potential effectiveness of meeting the unmet need for family planning services in helping to create resilience and increase adaptive capacity, both in general and also for the world regions most at risk. Family planning has really long been identified as an integral part of sustainable development strategies But again, our work here is to kind of refocus and expand the scope of this potential solution to be applicable in climate change and climate adaptation spheres, recognizing that reproductive health is both a human rights as well as an environmental imperative. And affected countries throughout the world are actually acutely aware of these very interconnected issues and have publicized the very real threats posed by population pressures as they relate, of course, to sustainable development, but also climate change adaptation. So the UN has actually developed a framework for less developed countries to use to identify some of the main drivers of climate vulnerability, with the hopes of helping them to sort of identify the major threats and sort of publicize them in exchange for funding from various standpoints. And so I'm bringing this up because out of the first 40 NAPA submissions put forth, 37 of them recognize the links that population pressures have to exacerbating other global issues, in particular climate adaptation. So that means that 93% of the submissions initially actually identified that at least one of three ways in which there are one of three ways in which demographic trends actually interact with climate impacts, either through faster degradation of environmental resources, increased demand for scarce resources, heightened human vulnerability to extreme weather events, and so on. And so these findings certainly do suggest that family planning services should be made more available to the communities most at risk. And yet only 6 countries actually identified investing in family planning as a priority to address that challenge. None of the NAPAs that have been submitted have directed investments in family planning. I'm going to take a quick sip of water here, sorry. So meeting the unmet need for reproductive health and family planning services and really addressing reproductive health care throughout the world actually also very much increases climate adaptation for women, families, and children. And this is research that was done recently by the World Watch Institute, as well as the Population Reference Bureau, which was looking at evidence linking population dynamics and climate compatible development. And so they've kind of come to the conclusion through research that reducing unintended pregnancies would result in many health, educational, and economic benefits for women in their households. And they concluded that these benefits could also reduce human vulnerability to climate impacts. And this is, kind of straightforward, but very, very simply, it's because women and children, whenever they have access to well, not necessarily contraceptives, but reproductive health care, as well as healthcare in general, that's a fundamental aspect of building climate resilience, right? Because women and children are healthier overall. Whenever women are also empowered to make their own decisions about their reproduction, whenever they're having children later as a consequence of that, that also increases possibilities for engaging in climate adaptation efforts from a variety of angles. Of course, whenever women have access to reproductive health care, rates of unintended pregnancies drop, which results in smaller families over time, and therefore a reduced demand for climate sensitive resources like that of food and water. And over the longer term, this contributes to slower population growth, which of course lessens pressure on local environments in terms of access to natural resources. And it also exposes fewer people to climate impacts, again, through meeting people's unmet need for family planning. So essentially by giving people access to the resources that they are saying they want, and that should theoretically be allocated to them as a fundamental human right. And in terms of climate change mitigation, so the capacity for reproductive health and family planning to actually offset emissions over time, innovations in reproductive health and education are really compelling in this sphere, especially, which is something that I think is a more indirect link, but something that's not as well known, but also a very exciting intervention. And again, while investments in smaller families may hold many instant social benefits, their impact on carbon emissions is not nearly as immediate. But again, I said this earlier, but over the long term, slowing population growth has the potential to outperform pretty much any other global intervention or solution. So on this slide, you'll see the top 5 solutions to climate change, which were put forth. This is based off of research by an organization called Project Drawdown, which is a nonprofit dedicated to producing sort of ongoing research on the potential effectiveness of different climate solutions in terms of upfront cost, overall cost, and potential emissions offsets and a variety of metrics. But they've argued, as you can see here, that health and education, so again, meeting the unmet need for family planning, as well as increasing access to education for women and girls in particular, could result in emissions reductions of up to 85 gigatons of CO2 by 2050. And just for reference, that's equivalent to removing over 22,000 coal-fired power plants permanently. And again, I think many of you might be familiar with Project Drawdown, but they do publish research that's ongoing, which ranks different solutions in terms of their projected emissions impacts globally. And they do this based off of different scenarios. So this slide depicts scenario 1, which is roughly in line with a 2% Celsius, or 2 degrees Celsius, excuse me, temperature rise by 2100. So what innovations would be most effective in kind of making that happen? And as you can see here, health and education are actually ranked second out of, there's only 10 listed here, but 82 different global solutions for its cost effectiveness upfront and for its return on investment. So again, giving people access to resources, helping people to transcend the poverty, to live healthier lives, to increase their standards of living, actually has a lot of other benefits as well, aside from just the social and political. So much so that it is ranked second out of 82 different climate solutions in terms of emissions offset, as well as upfront cost. And so that's kind of our focus as an organization, and we've been covering a lot of different information. So hopefully we can kind of tease some of the nuances out in the discussion period. But essentially, we're working to ensure everyone everywhere has access to the full spectrum of reproductive health care, including vital family planning services. And despite really impressive progress over the past several decades, there are still over 218 million women in LMICs alone who want to avoid pregnancy but are not using any modern form of contraception. In these countries, 49% of pregnancies are unintended, which annually totals 111 million unintended pregnancies. And while this presentation is very internationally focused, it's worth noting that affluent countries have a massive issue with unintended pregnancies as well, largely because it's a reflection of sort of policy. But in the United States, for example, about 44% of pregnancies are unintended as well. So it's a problem everywhere. And again, something that's very reflective of socioeconomic status as well as policy. So in contrast, if all women in LMICs were wanting to avoid pregnancy were able to do so through the use of modern contraceptives, excuse me. And if all pregnant women and their newborns were able to receive care at the levels recommended by the World Health Organization, the impacts would be really enormous and compelling. There would be a 68% decrease in unintended pregnancies, a 72% drop in unsafe abortions, and a 62% reduction in maternal deaths. And focusing on reproductive health is extremely important in general and always, again, for a variety of reasons, but often because it's quite polarizing. But also it's very critical at this particular point in time, as COVID-19 has drastically impacted access to these essential healthcare services throughout much of the world, including in the United States. In fact, estimates are now showing that millions of women and girls globally have lost access to contraceptives and abortion services because of the coronavirus pandemic. And this is largely because of resources being redirected to address the virus, because of lockdown measures that are ebbing and flowing depending on the country. Mary Stropes International recently reported that across 37 countries, nearly 2 million fewer women received services between January and June than they did in this period of time last year. 1.3 million of these people reside in India alone, which has been hit especially hard. These sort of estimates are likely going to be much higher as the impacts of COVID are still ongoing and disproportionately affecting lower income regions. Okay, so kind of in conclusion, if we're looking at kind of going back to the two examples we were looking at within the context of climate justice and climate vulnerability, reproductive health and sort of innovations in family planning have the capacity to really impact this region in positive ways. Again, we need to recognize that the most marginalized populations are the most vulnerable to climate change for many different reasons. And so the capacity to slow population growth through voluntary measures will not only increase the health and livelihoods and well-being of populations and women in particular, but it will also increase resilience for these populations as well. And in much of the Sahel, the use of contraceptives is below 10%, which is, very, very, very low, if not unheard of low. Recent studies indicate that only 5% of Nigeria's married women between the ages of 15 and 49 use modern contraceptives, but that over 20% have expressed an unmet need for family planning. So there's some real opportunity there for innovation. And while several different countries throughout this region, including Burkina Faso and Niger, have adopted policies actually to reduce fertility, there's many different sort of complex interconnected issues that are acting as barriers to the uptake of this, lack of political will being one of them. In addition to that, there are many different sort of social and cultural norms as well as gender inequities, as well as religious interpretations that have negatively impacted access to the use of family planning services. So importantly, we need to look at, the fact that increasing access to family planning services and reproductive health is not necessarily going to be, the be-all end-all solution. There needs to be a sort of integrated long-term approach that addresses these cultural and social barriers as well. In Bangladesh has actually made a really good point to invest very heavily in family planning, and they've consequently done really well in terms of reducing unmet need for family planning as well as total fertility rates. The total fertility rate was 6.8 children per woman in 1975, which is quite high. And it decreased to 2.2 children per woman in 2014. Today, it is about 2.05 births per woman, which is right at replacement level fertility. But almost 1/3 of pregnancies are unintended in this country, signaling an unmet need for family planning. There's also issues with documentation and again, with migration. Again, the total fertility rate, if the unmet need for family planning were to be met, would be 30% lower, right? In this particular context. So again, amidst a very sort of precarious situation in terms of climate and environmental sustainability, these innovations are more time sensitive and important than ever. And currently, family planning programs receive actually just 1% of all overseas developmental assistance from the United States. So fully meeting the current unmet need for family planning services for the 218 million women in developing regions who need access to this service would cost, according to some estimates, $12.1 billion annually. And including investments from donors, governments, and corporations, there still is a $5.3 billion funding gap for meeting the unmet need for family planning globally. Family planning programs, again, they just receive a small fraction of a portion of overall overseas developmental assistance. But the United States, very importantly, is consistently the single largest contributor of global health aid. But family planning is constantly under threat. It's a very partisan issue that sort of ebbs and flows in accordance with who's in power. So, during the past 4 years, funding for family planning programs was slashed. The United States in this period of time actually denied contributions to the UNFPA, which is a very which is a UN agency that distributes funds for and aid to different countries and organizations that are providing direct service in terms of contraceptives. The Trump administration also reinstated the global gag rule, which is a policy that we've been working on for the past 4 years in order to get it repealed permanently, because it's been so devastating for all countries that receive US aid. I need to update the slide, but the Biden administration has actually come in and repealed the global gag rule. So that's been a good thing in terms of increasing access to aid. But the sort of inconsistent funding stream that comes as a consequence of family planning being such a partisan issue within the United States is creating a really precarious situation for many different countries who are, again, experiencing these sort of compounding effects of poverty intertwined with climate impacts, intertwined with patriarchy and the oppression of women and so on. And so as an organization, we're really working to ensure that the global gag rule, which I can expand on in the discussion section, is repealed permanently. And that's why we're kind of working on what's called the HER Act, which is the Health Empowerment and Rights Act. We think it has a good chance of getting passed, but we'll see. So in conclusion, population growth contributes to climate vulnerability and climate change around the world. Slowing population growth through voluntary family planning services will positively affect global efforts to mitigate the effects of climate change, and it will ultimately and most importantly increase resilience for populations who are the most at risk. We need to be recognizing the potential effectiveness that comprehensive reproductive health care has in terms of fostering sustainable development and reducing climate impacts globally. Remember that family planning and reproductive health is very critical to, of course, women's empowerment, and really can also play a very impactful role in climate adaptation efforts. Rights-based innovations like voluntary family planning services and girls' education yields so many different social, environmental, economic benefits to society, and should be recognized as something that is a major contributor to emissions offsets over time. Family planning is also a very essential building block of resilience to climate impacts from various standpoints, but it deserves more recognition and funding. So again, they receive 1% of all overseas developmental assistance, and yet are some of the most cost-efficient and effective investments a country can make. So I'm just going to end by reciting this quote, which was written by Paul Hawken, who's one of the major authors of Drawdown. And it says, honoring the dignity of women and children through family planning is not about centralized governments forcing the birth rate down or up through natalist policies, nor is it about agencies or activists in rich countries where emissions are highest, telling people elsewhere to stop having children. It is most essentially about freedom and opportunity for women and the recognition of basic human rights. All right, we can open it up for questions. Those are both emails that I respond to. So if you have any questions that we don't get to, or that if you would like to get into contact with me for any other reason, please feel free to do so.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was an amazing presentation. So now we're going to transition into our Q&A section. I think we're going to have time to answer about 2 questions. So I'll just jump right in. Glad you got a sip of your water. Okay. Family planning is important to climate change, and you mentioned several cases of climate change such as industrialization and population growth, whereas many developing countries still need economic development that related to increasing global warming. How do you think they should balance economic development and environment at the same time?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's something that's kind of foundational to this entire issue. And again, we are in no position as affluent, people who, as representatives of an affluent country that emits some of the highest, CO2 emissions in the entire world. We're in no position to kind of dictate how people industrialize, or to say like, oh, there's not enough resources for you, or, oh, we have to really be careful now because we've already used up all of the resources and emitted this unsustainable amount of CO2 into the atmosphere. Like that is, completely unethical and also a ridiculous kind of assertion. And yeah, there are some really real imminent threats that we are collectively as a global society, as a global community facing, and we really don't have much time to address them. So I think that it's going to be really, really integral and vital for countries, especially within the continent of Africa, which is very quickly growing, to utilize and emphasize reproductive healthcare, renewable energy sources. Fossil fuel dependent economies need to become obsolete. And that is something that I think that we're reluctantly working towards. Unfortunately, there's a lot of entanglements, corporate entanglements in our political systems, but it's something that we all need to be doing. It's something that I think that Biden has kind of campaigned on and is moving towards from various standpoints. But it's something that is going to be a really, really difficult transition given how deeply, embedded fossil fuel production is into our society as we know it, and how powerful fossil fuel corporations are. It's important to note that a really small portion of fossil fuel corporations are actually contributing the most to the climate crisis. I think that it's often sort of, climate change is often posed as this issue that is put back onto the individual. And so we're kind of tasked with the, being more sustainable in terms of turning off our light bulbs or switching to paper straws or anything like that. But really what's driving this crisis are the fossil fuel corporations, a few of them at that. So if we can kind of recognize that and collectively transition to renewable energy sources, stop the subsidies that have allowed fossil fuel corporations and other processes like industrial agriculture, which are very oil heavy and completely unsustainable, to be cost effective, then other innovations will be way more viable. And part of this also has to do with sort of restructuring and revaluing commodities and other things within our economy. So it's kind of complex, but essentially I think that we really need to be looking at everyone throughout the world, especially developing regions. We need to be, sort of prioritizing and becoming way more reliant on renewable energy sources.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay.
This long-winded answer.
Yes. This next question kind of builds off of this one. And it's an amazing question with lots of amazing facts. Okay, it says, I appreciate you pointing out that countries and regions with growing populations are also the ones that are the most vulnerable. The emissions data shows that the main contributing reason for climate change is not population growth and high population growth developing countries, but high consumption rates in developing countries. For instance, the 300 million plus population of the US GHG per capita, that is more than double that of Europe, 5 times the global average, and more than 10 times that average of developing countries. Historically, US remains the largest contributor to the GHG emissions. Considering these facts, a strong argument has been made that the responsibility of leading the climate action lies more with the developed countries to reduce their emissions due to high consumption and emissions of luxury. What is your opinion of this?
Yeah, I mean, that was a really great and thorough explanation. Thank you for putting forth all of the statistics, and you're absolutely right. And I think it's really important to recognize that as an organization, what we're working on is, we're working in the nexus of 3 major global issues, and we're looking at the capacity for slowing population growth through voluntary measures to help mitigate climate change and to increase resilience in some ways, right? We're not in any way asserting that global population growth is the biggest contributor to climate change, or that people residing in the poorest regions of the world are contributing the most to climate change and should slow their population. As a consequence of that, of course, we've kind of debunked that throughout the presentation, and that's not true. I think that's one of the reasons why historically population dynamics have gotten a lot of flack, and rightfully so, because there are major disparities in resource use and consumption patterns and so on. And the fact is, as you pointed out, a very small portion of the global population contributes the overwhelming majority of the Earth's resources. And yet, what we really do need to be looking at with regards to demographic trends is the fact that there are many different, most of the world right now is in a position where they're industrializing, where they're building wealth and increasing affluence and increasing overall health and access to resources and everything else. And it's all of that's a really, really great thing, but we really need to be, again, collectively looking at this as a global community, as a species almost, to put it in primitive terms, and recognizing what that's going to mean. And that's not to say that we need to ensure that only certain people are allowed, certain access to resources or anything like that. It's just to say, okay, like, what's the solution to this? We can convert to renewable resources. We can really point out consumption patterns in the United States and restructure our economy so that things that are super environmentally offensive are not super cheap and affordable in comparison to local, options. We need to restructure, the way that we're consuming food and producing food. I mean, all of these things are really, really complex. But again, I think it's really important to note that consumption is a major, major issue, but the reliance on fossil fuels is very much a reflection of corporate interest. So fossil fuel companies have known for a really long time that fossil fuel emissions and CO2 emissions are contributing to climate change, creating an unsustainable planet. They have refused to acknowledge this. They've sown a bunch of doubt, as with any other industry that's toxic. And they are, major culprits, and they do things like put, the blame onto the consumer, or, focusing on single-use plastics or whatever as a way to distract from this broader issue of them really fueling this reliance. So yeah, I mean, again, all of these issues are very complex. And as an organization, we are just focused in reproductive rights and access to family planning. And we do this from a variety of angles. We have a political focus that is very focused on political advocacy and really, working with politicians and advocating for specific policies and laws which will institutionalize reproductive rights domestically and abroad. And we also have an educational sphere which looks at and really kind of explores the implications of population dynamics on the planet in various ways. So this is, again, not to say that population is a sole contributor. It's just to kind of educate people about the interconnections of these issues. And really, within the context of climate change, I think that we're going to be having to form these solutions and really like reconceptualize the way that we interact with each other and the planet. And I think that integrated solutions, again, that address many different issues at once are the way forward. And so in that sense, that's kind of what we're trying to emphasize.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom and some solutions that we can focus on and work together. This has been an amazing thing. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you everyone for coming. We want to again thank the Marine Biology Club, Community Planning Group, and Permaculture Tigers for co-sponsoring this event. We're the Auburn's Office of Sustainability. Oh my goodness. Hannah, thank you again so much for your expertise, sharing a topic that you're so passionate about and just educating us on everything. And again, if y'all want to follow Hannah and Population Connection, everything that they're doing, all their information is right there. Okay, well, everyone have an amazing day. Happy Tuesday.
Thanks, everyone.